Chapter 2, St. George. The sun shimmered and shone across the emerald green fields as a cool summer breeze swept through, grass waving lazily as specks of blue and pinks bobbed along. Laughter drifted over the horizon as a small boy played with his mother. Alan couldn't help but smile, just a simple moment, yet so profound. Boy running about in a shirt with his favorite cartoon character was in high spirits as his mother gave chase, hands outstretched reaching for him, and her baby blue dress played along with her stride. Their laughter echoed through the air, giving a feeling of enchantment. "Come here, little James. I'm going to get you." Eliza lunged out at the boy, grabbing and laughing. As Alan looked on, he realized that he could not move. His eyes seemed to be closed, and he couldn't open them all the way, being able to see what was unfolding before him. Arms penned by an unseen force, and he struggled to speak. Eliza's smile grew insidious. Her teeth ground against each other. She continued to move forward down upon James. Alan struggled and flailed to be released from his invisible bonds. His words stifled within his throat. He could feel his eyes rolling behind his eyelids, pushing to just open them in order to see clearly. Eliza moved ever so slowly, dragging out the inevitable outcome. Just as her mass fell upon James, Alan sprang awake, screaming. The sound rang in his ears as his breath caught up, adjusting to the small space in the inner lining of his hat. His crown held the stench of his hot breath, stagnant and claustrophobic, forcing his body to move through the dirt. Heaving with dust and debris, he crawled out. Limbs became lighter as he freed his body from his resting place. Night's first light set calmly over the desert with little to no cloud cover. The full moon was rising, and often the darkness howls of admiration and longing called out to it. The steam mare sat lifeless, tied to a struggling branch. It seemed pointless to tie it down without its core, yet leaving it untied seemed to be lazy. Brushing off the dirt, gathering his hat, Alan prepared for the next leg of his journey to St. George. With a grunt of disappointment, he came to understand that he was about half a day into a 3 or 4 day ride. Placing the core back into the steam air, it reared its head and shook, breathing life and steam. The simple pleasures made more apparent by his age, and yet even more so comforting. He mounted the steam-powered mare and gathered his bearings. As he started to trot away from his makeshift camp, he heard low growls and heavy breathing. Looking toward their direction, glints of faint eyes danced along the horizon just above the ground. Direwolves, Jack's pets. However, these were not Jack's. They were wild, and they only adhered to their rules and that of the desert. Standing just below the same height of the steam air's haunch, with a mix of fur and scales, their pack marched along Alan, following by him but never close enough to truly see them. After an hour's ride, they parted away, and he was alone once again. The struggle of dreams from the day's rest still fresh in his mind, the air still and cool with the pale moonlight covering the night. Sand gave way to rock and hills, reaching the mainland. After the fall, everything shifted, oceans to desert, plains to mountains. Once the world before it had been scarred by war and the power that should have not come to be. Dismounting and guiding the mare through the rocky terrain, he pushed forward. Tufts of grass began to grow as the rocks gave way to soil with shrubs, and they to trees. Smaller at first, then into a forest. The forest was small and secluded, its existence only possible due to its location. While a vast majority of the planet's surface water disappeared as a result of the final push that caused the fall, the rest went underground. The trees grew unusually large, along with roots growing far down into the earth. As Alan pushed forward, Through the trees and underbrush, voices rose, lifting up sounds of merriment and laughter. Moonlight gave way to the warm glow of campfire, casting shadows over a small clearing which a pond was nestled. The fire's light danced across the smooth surface as calm as glass. Its mirrored image on the banks were a band of people joking and enjoying the evening air. Oh, you should have seen her, an absolute babe. Beautiful eyes, boobs you just want to sleep in. A man smiled and nodded. Come on, you're always saying that they have large breasts, Blaine. Did you even get her into bed? Laughing and joking, the second man pointed out. You guys are so childish. Never any class. A woman's voice perked up. Ha, Ivy, you're just mad because nobody wants you. Besides, you're one of the guys. Who cares? Blaine gave with a snide smile. You bet I did, John, and it was just sweet honey all night long, hugging himself and making noises, mocking a romantic night. Alan tied the steam mare and bent over the pond, filling a small flask, and chuckled. Give me a woman whose soul is broken and death dances in her eyes, like reflection of flames upon a candlestick. Lips like sweet poison, dress of crimson, blacker than coal. Soft pale skin, sickly sweet, in whose arms I lay my final breath to rest within her breast. I would seem we have company, guys, a fourth voice called out. And who would you be, sir? I don't think this was that common of a place. Oh, and my name is Eric. Just a wrench for this bunch. Eric stepped forward by the fire and grinned. Another round fellow with a strange shirt overalls. He was a portly man with a rather large wrench by his sides. Double covered his aged face with a ring of wiry hair wrapped around his head, leaving quite the bare spot on top. He was wary, but also civil in his approach. Last breath in her breast, huh? I can't see a better way to go than that. Blaine chuckled and turned towards Alan from the fire. Tall and lanky, he seemed to produce two blades and just as quickly put them away. He wore a tight green jacket with pants that bellowed out from the waist and back just at the top of his ankles. Giving Alan a once-over, he continued, Not a bad way to go. I think it's rather romantic, a female voice said, jumping down from the top of the barrel set by the fire. She had a tight leather jacket with high boots on. A bow was slung across her back, along with a quiver bristling with arrows. She was elegant and moved with grace while still showing her strength. Her muscles were toned, dictating her dedication to training. I'm Ivy, she said with a girlish smile. As she finished, a large man stood, skin as dark as night. His shoulders were almost just as large as Paul's. The man didn't stand as tall, but was at least 6 inches wider than him. Well, look at that, he boomed, laughing. I'm John. Come join us for the night. The fire is quite warm, and water is sacred, so there's no reason for any untoward business. He smiled and laughed, extending his arms as he gestured toward the fire. 2 huge hammers hung from his leather belt by his side. His shirt struggled to contain his bulk and left Alan questioning whether it would survive. Begrudgingly, Alan sighed and walked over to join them. For a moment, it was nice, a sudden reprieve from his world of isolation. Sitting there, taking in the moment as if time slowed to a crawl, laughing and enjoying the night air. John was their leader with a good head on his shoulder, while Blaine was scrupulous despite his lack of manners. Eric was the group's engineer who kept their vehicle moving, a rather large military-style truck. It was armored with thin slits for windows, steam pipes tucked in numerous nooks. As far as vehicles go, it was a monster in its own class. Alan admired the machine as Eric placed his hands on his shoulder. Yes, she's a beauty, isn't she, Eric beamed up at it. Quite a pain to keep running nowadays, but she does her part without complaint. Say, where did you come from anyway? Me? Nowhere in particular, just running errands for an old friend out of Daedalus. Alan replied, Daedalus, you say? Not many go out that way, not unless you've got business with the gilded people. You say you're running errands, huh? Aaron looked intently at Alan, finally giving a nod as if approving his answer. Errands it is, then. We ourselves are headed out from St. George. Got us a lead on a payday. Ah, yes, 10,000 coppers, Ivy chimed in as she jumped down from her perch on their vehicle. She was the group's long-range shooter, steady-handed and limber. Where are you headed? Actually, I'm headed to St. George. How fortuitous, but you've still got a few days to the south to get there before maybe more, if you're walking there. Blaine eyed Alan. No, I've actually have my own ride, so it shouldn't take much more than a day or so. What do you mean? I would love to know what it is, Eric asked. Just an old steamer, nothing special. Eric's eyes lit up with excitement. No way, that would mean you have some sort of way to get it up and running. May I see? Eric, despite his years over the group, became giddy and childlike. Alan walked Eric over to where he had tied the mare down. Here you go. See, nothing quite to it. Oh my, this is in a very good shape, but there's no modification to it. It's all original. How did you get it to work? Eric was looking over the steamer's body with careful consideration. Wait, does that mean? He turned, looking at Alan. Yes, I have a core, Alan chuckled. Amazing. I did not think I've seen one in many years, not since I was a boy. Eric paused for a moment, and surprise suddenly painted his face. He looked up from the mare at Alan. I knew you looked familiar, but you haven't changed a bit, not in over 60 years. Alan peered down at Eric in a bit of confusion. I was the boy with the wrench, too big for me. I met you in my hometown. It's gone now. It didn't last long after that day. I see. That was you, and it appears you grew into that wrench. For a moment, Alan could see as a small, angry boy who dragged a wrench too heavy for him to use properly. Face covered in grease while his scowl burned holes everywhere he looked. Alan laughed at the sight, thankful that not every memory was a burden after so long of a life. Let's see those eyes, pal, Blaine broke in, smashing the calm. Not now, Blaine, Eric clapped back as he stepped between Blaine and Alan. Why, you know what we do, don't you, old man? We can't just do nothing. Blaine balked. Not this one, not here, not now. Eric pushed forward, and as Blaine pushed back, John pulled both men apart. What's going on with you two? It's time to hit the wreck anyway. He pushed the two towards the campsite, turning toward Alan. He shook his head. Sorry, but it's best we call it here. He turned away, shaking his head in disbelief and regretted. Alan knew all too well what had happened, and walked back to the steamer. With a shake and an annoyed grunt, he prepared himself and the mare to leave. Reminded of the grease-covered kid and the wrench that was too big gave him some solace. Hey, mister, you're sure getting in late, Eric's childless voice echoed in Alan's head. Hey, do you need any fixed or work done? I'm the best around this little town. The young Eric beamed up with his wrench slung over his shoulder. The voice hung in his head and echoed through. 60 years was gone, and yet that same boy grew and thrived, even in such times. John finished up clearing the site and tying down the gear as everyone went to their tents tucked among the tree line. Ivy steered as Alan mounted the steamer and pushed on through the opposite side of the pond. Soon the darkness, broken only by night's glimmer and the silence of the forest, were Alan's companions. After a few hours of riding, his skin pulled at his spine as the sun began rising. He gritted his teeth and dug into the steamer's side, urging it for more speed. Trees became posts of green and brown blurs. Branches reached out and threatened to pull him down from the saddle. His skin grew tighter, and the heat from the morning sun began to oppress his very being. As steam and smoke began rising from beneath his collar, a wall of rock came into view. He sprang from his mount and sped beyond the shrubs, revealing a small opening. Leading the mare into the gaping black hole, he stepped through. It wasn't a large space, but hidden enough that many would not notice that it was there. The pain of his skin began to fade as he slid down the wall. Panting from the strain, he used the cool, damp walls for support. Disappointments raked his face. He had gotten lost in the moment and forgotten the time. It was too close. He could not die just yet. His visions faded away as he drifted to a deep sleep. "Hey, mister, did you hear me?" Young Eric called out. Alan looked down at the boy, confused. "What did you say, son?" "I said, do you need repairs or any work? I know it's late, but I don't mind the last-minute work," Eric reiterated. The young boy stood proud, rubbing his nose on the back of his hand and then that on his pants. Alan couldn't help but smile and bent down to his level. "No, I think I've got everything in order. I'm actually looking for whomever is in charge of this town. I heard rumors about a job people were having trouble with and figured I would try my hand." "Oh, that's going to be the church over there," young Eric pointed at the large building down the road. "Everybody is in there now. If you hurry, you should catch the next group. They pretty much just throw as many people at it now anyway." "Thank you. I'll sure let you know if I need any work done." "You will? Thanks, mister. I'll be here," young Eric said while hoisting the wrench over his head. As Alan walked towards the building, there were few buildings down the road, and of those the church was by far the largest and was remarkable, to say the least. The small town was run down even by the standard of the age. Daylight was at twilight's peak, fading into darkness. As Alan worked his way through the street, an unusual air pulled at him, threatening to drag him to the ground. Every fiber of his being screaming of impending doom lurking from behind the very shadows of his feet. Alan grew closer to the church, and glints of fire-orange light flickered through the windows. You could hear the murmurs of the townsfolk chanting just beyond the door. Among them one called out, leading the crowd, "We will live in the glory of the Lord's shadow. He will lead us beyond life itself." Alan pushed open the church doors, immediately being crushed by the feeling of dread. Everything was wrong. "What do we have here, brothers and sisters? A lost lamb comes from out of the light to the shadow of our Savior." The voice was that of a preacher who had been leading the chants. His very presence oozed toxicity. His breathing brought bile to Alan's mouth, burning his throat. Everything was wrong. The few people who sat sparsely through the church pews moved awkwardly and continued their chanting. Small gestures catching the corner of his eyes led his vision to the front rows where small children had also gathered, clinging to the priest's pants while they themselves were chanting. The priest was dirty and foul, clergy collar stained almost black with grime. His hair clung to his forehead with grease and sweat. Eyes fevered, well filled with faraway images of glory not yet realized. He raised his hands out in a welcoming embrace. "Come, embrace me and join our God's grace," he called out to Alan. "There is no God here, priest, and there is no life amongst your people." Alan's hackles rose as the priest sneered with disgust. "How dare you question the Holy Lord's presence? Even now he works to give everlasting life within the darkness." Splutter flung from his mouth as he shook his head uncontrollably. The priest stepped down from his pulpit, pushing aside the children at his feet, cursing their hindrance. "If you're not here for our Lord, then why have you come? Or did you come here for a job?" The priest's laugh was unsettling. "If that's the case, you'll find yourself wanting. You're here because I wanted you here. The Lord will gladly take your sacrifice." Wild-eyed and with a gaping grin of grime-filled teeth consumed by rot and waste, What Lord of God would want such disgusting creatures? Even now they decay, Alan replied with fury. Even the children smell of death. With a smile that chilled the bones, the priest backed away a step as the few townsfolk drew closer to Alan. One of great vision and power, the priest replied. Just as Alan moved forward, a hand snagged his shoulder, gripping with inhumane force just on the verge of destroying his bones. Alan spun, grabbing the arm that grabbed him. As he turned, facing his assailant, he pulled the arm from the former residents of the town. Bone and sinew popped and cracked as the limb was ripped away from the man's body. He pushed on to Alan, unfazed by the sudden loss of his appendage. He fumbled to control Alan with the other. His flesh was blistered and covered by weeping sores that festered with rot, a scent so foul it threatened Alan's ability to stand straight. Alan swinging the severed arm at his assailant, knocking him back. As the other man fell back, Alan spun around, facing a second approaching from behind. This time he faced a man with a larger build than the first. A wrench hung from his belt. The sores were fairly fresh as well, were there fewer than the first man's. He jumped at Alan with startling speed. Alan punched his hand through the man's chest, flesh splitting from the tip of Alan's fingers, breaking the man's ribs. Alan's hands reached into his chest cavity, crushing the man's heart. Alan turned to the one-armed man, who began to stand back to his feet, and swung the arm with all of his might. The man's own extremity landed on his head, exploding brain matter and pieces of skull across the pews. Alan turned once again to face the priest, only to be met by a third ghoul, this time a woman. She would have been beautiful when she was alive, a slender build and brunette hair that only partly covered her head, while parts of skull were visible. Her flesh seemed to melt from her face, exposing her eye socket, while the other gray from death. She moved like a ballerina, agile and nimble, bouncing from one foot to the next. Alan dodged as he waited for his opening, springing forth as it presented itself. He grabbed her face, crushing it between his hands. Alan shook her remains from his hands as he stepped forward over her body, making his way to the priest. The priest panicked, stumbled over the stairs to the pulpit he had stood so proudly at. As Alan continued his ascent, the small children began to claw at his pants. Again, the stench of decay lingered over him. His eyes stung and blurred with tears welling up. His rage overwhelmed him, and Alan kicked the first boy's body, falling apart as tiny intestines strewed from his two distinct halves. The mass of body parts slammed against the wall just beyond the priest's head. Alan reached down, grabbing the other by his head and leg. He pulled. Sound of flesh pulling apart hung over the silence, followed by the squelching splatter of the boy's organs hitting the floor. Alan could barely see through his tears streaming down his face. They were twins. Finally, he stood there over the priest, alone in silence. Alan's screams obliterated the empty room. "How dare you? Why? What purpose could you serve by doing this?" The priest's face was pale terror. He stammered and jawed. There was a new scent in the air as he froze. The priest's urine pooled around the man, steaming rays from it. Alan's sneer was all too pleased, picking the priest up, pulling him face to face. They were just boys, brothers, twins, for God's sake. His screams echoed off the wall, shaking the very ground. Alan threw the priest upon the floor, sending spittle and blood from the priest's mouth. "Please," he gurgled as the blood filled his lungs. "I only did what my Lord told me," coughing up blood as he staggered to breathe. Alan, unable to respond, instead let out a primal scream. Every ounce of his being filled his lungs. Nothing remained but rage. He began slamming him down over and over. Crunching bone gave way to squelching as his hands left nothing of his body behind. Once he finally stopped, his breath was heaving and his arms were heavy with fatigue. His body wanted to give way from his efforts. He stood up, looking down at what left of the priest. A head laid there, barely attached. The neck, shoulders, or most of the chest was an unrecognizable mass, with arms on either side. Alan walked back to the doors and gathered his things. He turned and looked over the room while grabbing the last lit lamp. He threw it down and flames spewed like water following the oil. For a moment, he watched the flames spin across the floor and onto the bodies laying about. Fire danced in his eyes, mesmerized by it. Well, it pulled at him. It spread over everything, finally reaching the boys' bodies, and he shook himself out of his daze. He left as the whole building began to burn and the fire bells rang in the cold night air. The familiar scent of night's dew woke Alan. Stepping out from the hidden crevice, he gathered his things. Stepped from the close call of the day ordeal. He mounted the steamer once again. The air grew crisp and crackled from the cold as he climbed higher into the mountains. Finally reaching his destination and emerging from the forest onto the main road into town. The early evening still had a consistent bustle of the town's people. While it was a town nestled in the mountains, St. George was quite large in comparison to Daedalus. The city was one of the few still capable to survive with steam. The front gates were guarded and people were making their way through as the guards checked them in. Alan approached the gate and was checked in by the guards. Both men were impressed by his steam air. While they were not unseen here, they were still not a commonplace item. After the guards were done, Alan inquired about the Golden Explorer. Stepping through the gates, people were busy with finishing up their daily task or looking for some relief from the day. Alan began to make his way through the streets with its buildings crowded together. Various shops and vendors lined the streets with signs painted with slogans. Most were closing up as the night's chill settled in. Steam rose and hissed from various parts of the city and kept steady time. He continued to make his way through town towards the main square, a large circle with off streets into the rest of town. In its center was a rather large yet newer statue of a man. It shone with the glint of gold on its base was the name of the town's mayor. It was a proud-looking man who wore a top hat and fine suit. Alan chuckled at the sight and turned down a side street, eventually finding himself on a street with several inns. Each had its own unique air and stature. Some were higher-end establishments, while others catered to the more common rabble. He continued on his way through the narrow streets toward the end where he found the Golden Explorer tucked away in the corner. Its sign hung over the door, sporting a silhouette of a man holding up a lantern with beams of light streaming from it, all lacquered in gold. After securing the steamer to the post and removing its core, he grabbed his bags and pushed into the door. Despite its location, the front room was clean and well kept. A few patrons sat scattered about the room while a musician played a light song as he strummed his guitar. Alan walked up to the bar where he found the bartender going about his duties. "Yes, sir, how can I help you tonight?" the bartender said with a smile as he continued what he was working on. "I've got a package sent from Reuben and the Gilded People." Alan reached into his bag and pulled out the package. Rolling it over in his hand, it felt oddly familiar. He put it on the bar. "Ah, yes, I do remember that someone requested this be sent here." Immediately, the bartender stopped what he was doing and scooped up the package. Just as quickly as Alan had presented it, the bartender had made it disappear. Was there anything else that I could help you with tonight? He continued with a smile. Do you have a room available for a day? Alan asked, knowing that he would like at least to have some time to rest after making his way to St. George. Of course we do. It's 15 kappa a day. Good, that's fine. Alan pulled the appropriate amount from his pocket and handed it to him. Right, here's your key, and your room is the last door on the right, just up the stairs there. The bartender gestured toward the staircase in the corner of the room and handed him the key. I also would like to know if you have a place where I can tie my steamer to. Steamer? Well, that's a treat for sure. We have a few spots behind the building. You're more than welcome to tie it there. He continued to smile as he went back to the task he had been working on. Alan took his leave and walked up to the room. The stairs were short while the hallway narrow. He reached his room, opening the door to a quaint room. A small bed was in one corner while a small table sat in the other. Moonlight shone through a small window on the opposite wall from the door. Sighing, Alan placed his things on the table, then walked back outside. He placed the core back into the mare and moved it behind the building. Rain had started to fall, muddying the ground. As he was finishing up with the mare, he turned to walk back towards the building. Steamer with a core. Now that's a sweet deal indeed, a voice called out from the darkened night. Hello? Who's there? Alan replied. Out stepped a gnarled man, hunched over with a large pack tied to his back. His skin seemed to be as thin as paper while being as rough as coarse sand. All manner of trinkets, from pots and pans to random knickknacks, were tied to the pack. They swayed with his movement, knocking about with clanging and chimes alike. Would you like a trade? I have a wondrous device capable of producing fire whenever you need. The strange man pulled out a small object from one of his copious pockets. And who might you be? Alan asked, eyeing the strange creature standing in front of him. Oh, me, I'm just a humble merchant, traveling from here to there. You can just call me that. A merchant, huh? Alan looked on, curious as to how he found himself in this particular spot. Yes, you might say I am the merchant. Oh boy, you've done it now, a small voice called out into the night. Quiet you, the merchant hissed. Excuse me, Alan said. Oh, not you, the merchant began to nervously wash his hands with a wary smile. Don't listen to a word he says, the same voice exclaimed. Shut up, or you'll be thrown in with my dirty smalls again. What is going on, and why does it sound like you have someone stashed away in your pack? Alan questioned with a visible disgruntled look. I do apologize. My associate is rather disgruntled. The merchant turned to one side, and what appeared to be a small head swung from what few hairs were still on his head. Disgruntled, you could say that, being how I'm a shrunken head tied by his hair and stuck with you for a conversationalist. The head yammered on. The merchant tried to stifle the onslaught and was bitten for his troubles. Alan had seen a lot over his years, however, this was a first. Well, I'm going to leave you two lovebirds to it. I've got other matters to worry about. Oh, and I already have a lighter. Just as Alan turned to walk away, the merchant grabbed his arm with surprising strength. Take care, stranger, especially at night. The shrunken head had stopped dead, and the silence began to ring in his ear. What do you mean, merchant? The very tone shifted. They say people have been missing from the night. Strangers, or those from the street. Nobodies, the merchant whispered as he walked away. Alan turned back, and the merchant was nowhere to be seen. The shadows clung to darkened corners, with what was left to the open space covered by what little moonlight shone in the distance. Contemplating what the merchant had warned him about, he made his way back into the inn, the barkeeper still polishing cups that no one used, while the main room was empty. With what had transpired earlier, everything seemed just a bit off, as if two puzzle pieces that looked like a fit but weren't. A heightened awareness of every shift of air gave him an unwelcoming feeling. Alan entered his room and closed the curtain on the window while grabbing the pillow from the bed. Reluctantly, he shoveled it and himself under the bed, an unfortunate circumstance, yet still better than in the ground. Shivering and cold, Alan clutched his rifle, soaked to his bones. With mud-filled boots, he sat with two other men, desperately trying to get as close as they could to the small fire. It had been raining for 3 days straight and showed no signs of stopping. The trenches were filled with water and mud, making walking a chore. The walls slick from the torrent and threatened to swallow up anyone foolish enough to lean too long. Anyone was exhausted while morale ran in short supply. If it wasn't hell, he wondered how far it was from the real thing. Men started to scatter in a frenzy, popping over the top in order to fire at the enemy. Just as Alan moved and stood, something hit him in the back hard and seemed to knock the wind out of his chest. While he was catching his breath, he turned only to be pushed out of the way by one of the two men. Before Alan could understand the situation, an explosion rang out. Sitting up suddenly, he smashed his head against the bottom of the bed. More explosions came from outside his room. Irritated by his abrupt awakening, he pushed aside the curtains. Just out of the window, colors bloomed into the night sky, and music played off in the distance. Even the sounds of celebration and excitement could be heard from inside the inn. He stumbled downstairs into the dining room and found it filled to capacity. Drinks flung from every direction as the bartender worked like magic. Mugs filled just as quickly as they emptied. Alan pushed his way through to the bar. "What's this all about?" "It's a celebration, of course," the bartender replied. "Yes, I can see that, but why?" "Oh, the mayor decided that it should be a celebration tonight, and it was so. Honestly, he seems to be doing this more often than not." He smiled. "I see." Alan was more intrigued and continued on his way. He forced his way out of the crowd and found himself in the middle of the streets. It seemed like the festival was in full swing, with people stumbling through as they sang. Making his way back to the main square with the golden statue, he found himself looking in at the main bulk of the participants. Everyone cheered as they looked on at a man standing over the statue on a balcony. He waved at the crowd with grand gestures and looks of gratitude on his face. His smile was unnerving, while it never truly reached his eyes. "Tonight, I want you all to know that I'm so very proud of you. You deserve the celebration for your contribution to our hard-fought society. You're the backbone that holds what's left of our country today. You're all leaders and heroes, so take solace in knowing that your contributions are not unnoticed. I appreciate the lot of you, so drink and celebrate." Still, his smile never wavered as he turned and disappeared into the doorway of the balcony. A particular sight for sure, but the people only cheered louder while he finished. Everyone was hard-pressed to see who could celebrate more as the throng moved on. Some stayed dancing in the streets and others laughed and jeered. Stumbling across the plaza, a woman began to cry out. Panic struck, she clung to anyone who was close enough. Clearly disheveled, she pleaded for help. Alan was an outsider here and stood alone. She ran to him, falling to her knees, a dress of finely cut silks torn and dirty. Her hair was frayed and makeup ran with her tears. "Please, my daughter," she said through the broken sob, "someone has taken her. We came to visit this place because of the festival. Help, please." "Where did they go?" Alan questioned firmly. Normally he wouldn't get involved with others, however, this pulled at his own plight. She continued sobbing and gestured to the alley just ahead of them. Rushing to the alley, he closed the gap in an instant. He could smell the scent of the woman mixed with something else, with what clearly was a musk of an unwashed man. He pursued the scent down the alley as it turned and bent behind buildings. As he followed further down, the noises of the celebration began to fade. He drew closer to his quarry with every passing second. Their scents grew, and he began to hear them clamoring in the distance. As Alan turned the corner, he saw a man who was scrawny and covered in dirt dragging a struggling girl into a cedar grate. He threw the girl down the grate. He noticed Alan with a look of shock. He jumped after her. Alan rushed to catch the man, but missed as the grate fell. He bent over to open it again and found it to be locked. He grabbed the opening of the grate with both hands and pulled. Its iron bars gave a small groan, then a loud clang as it pulled away from its lock. Jumping into the dark corridor, he failed to find them. He began to rely on his nose, barely picking up on their scents, muddled with the damp air and sewer waste. Moving forward, he tracked it while rats scurried along the walls. "Hey, I got you a young one like you asked," a man's voice echoed down the corridor. "Good, she's definitely is a beauty, isn't she?" a familiar voice replied. "Yeah, she is, sir. Oh, and there was some man in the alley, but I gave him the slip." "Oh, yeah? Well, let's hope for your sake that you did. We don't need a repeat of last time." Alan closed the distance to the corner just in time to see the exchange. The mayor turned and walked away from the grimy man with the girl grasped tightly in his hands, dragging her away. Others cried out from one side of the room. Rusted cages stacked against the walls were filled with random people, men, women, and children stuffed into cages like animals, some too small for the individual to even sit right. In the middle of the room, a steel table sat with chains hanging just above it. Flies buzzed at its feet where decaying carcasses and body parts were strewn. Strangely, the opposite wall hung various limbs made up of gears and piping, not much different than how a steamer was constructed. As the mayor walked away, the other man picked up an iron fire poker and ran it down the cage bars. Laughing and prodding the captives, he teased them. Alan rushed in, slamming the man against the cages, twisting his arm behind his back. "Keys, now," he growled at him. Over by the limbs, shaking and shuddering from Alan's abrupt approach. "Please don't hurt me, I just work here," he pleaded. "Yeah, I've heard that before." Alan sneered at him as he pulled the man's arm from out of the socket and then completely from his body. He screamed and fell to the floor just before passing out with the look of disdain and frustration on his face. Alan bounced forward quickly, grabbing the keys, and began to unlock the cages. "Quickly now, help the others. I'll head after the girl," Alan told the first man, the first man still capable of standing upright. Handing the keys to the man, he ran to the hallway where the mayor had left. Steam pipes ran down the ceiling, and along the edges its narrow length was dimly lit by small bulbs hanging overhead. He pursued the mayor down the damp corridor, hoping to reach its quarry in time. Its hallway turned and twisted until it opened up again to a large room. It was much larger than the first and held strange capsules. "Sleep now, my angel. You'll be with our Lord soon enough," the mayor cooed as he shut the small girl into one of the capsules. It hissed as the air sealed her in. "Leave her now," Alan called out. "And who is this Lord you spoke of?" Startled, the mayor turned quickly to face Alan while standing over the girl. "What are you going to do here?" Gaining his composure, he pushed back at Alan. "It holds no matter who or what. You're simply an errand boy. Of course I know that you're here on a delivery from the Gilded People. I tend to hear these things fairly quickly." The mayor grinned as his confidence swelled. "That's cute. Hand over the girl." "Of course I can't do that. She's not mine to hand over. She's been chosen for a much higher purpose by the Dark Lord, and you're in no position to do anything about it. Oh, really? Why would you think that? All you have done is talk about your Dark Lord. I've heard that once before, many years ago. What does he have to do with this nonsense? Without warning, the mayor sprang at Alan in a bank of steam bellowing from his body. He slammed into Alan, sending him sliding across the floor with a thud against the wall. The mayor stood where Alan had just moments before, fixing his cuffs. See, you're weak, and I don't answer to you, he continued, smiling as he launched into another attack. Alan stood to meet his attacker's onslaught, catching his fist, stopping the mayor dead in his tracks. His once confident smile shifted to confusion, then to panic as he tried to pull away. It would seem that your information was incomplete, the mayor struggled as he attempted to pull away while Alan stood unflinching. Steam poured over them both, tearing at the once fine suit he had worn. Torn clothes give way to gears and pipes over the majority of his body. Alan smiled as the gears began to grind, with sparks flying from their struggle. Now, about who was weak, Alan slammed down the mayor's arms, shattering both in a rain of gears, steam, and pipes. Crawling away with stubbled shoulders leaking fluid, the mayor clamored, "Who are you? You can't do this. I'm protected. This city is his. I serve him." In the last-ditch attempt, he flung himself at Alan, only to be crushed under his boot. "Who, me? I'm just an errand boy, remember?" Alan chuckled at the popping sound from the mayor's head being smashed beneath his feet. He wasted no time reaching the capsule where the small girl had been forced into. Strange and out of place, it sat there like a glass coffin with various electrical cords running along the outer edges. The little girl, breathing, was shallow and slow as it steamed against the portal. Time seemed to be stopped on the other side of the glass. He began looking over at the capsule, searching for a way to open it. Unable to find a clasp or any other mechanism to open, he then forced it open, pulling at the seals and ripping it off. For a brief moment, the little girl sat unchanged beneath. Breath still came at slow pace. Then all at once he sprang upright, sucking in all the air her chest could contain. At the height of her inhale, she crumpled over, coughing, trying to steady herself on the side of the capsule. "Where am I? What happened to my mom?" She managed to choke out before her coughing. "Oh, good. It looks like you'll be all right. As for your mom, she asked me to meet you." Alan smiled and was relieved to see her talking and moving about. "No, I don't think so." Her reply was full of confidence as she sat up straight as to lecture Alan. "Oh, how's that, little one? Well, I know everyone my mom's knows, and I have never seen you before," she continued in the same manner. Alan couldn't help but laugh. "Well, that's because I just met your mom only moments before. As far as where you are, your guess is as good as mine. Maybe I should have left old Steamy there alive and asked him," he replied as he pulled her out of the capsule and sat her down on the table next to them. It was cluttered with various equipment and paperwork, most too old to make out or broken, but a list caught his eye, 2 names in particular, Eliza and James. Alan snatched the board from the table, kicking up dust, causing the little girl to cough while waving it all away. "What did you find?" she asked, after wiping away the dust. He was sure it was their names, clear as day. "Something unexpected. Quickly, we need to go and get you to your mother." Alan stuffed the list into his jacket pocket and scooped her up in his arms. He swept through the tunnels back the way that he came, clutching the girl close. For a second, he thought she was crying from his speed. He looked down, and she was beaming and laughing. Finally, reaching the end, they sprang out above the entrance to the sewers. He had first pursued the man who had stolen her. She grasped tightly as they floated weightless in the cool night's air before reaching the ground once again. He loved being a dad and making his child smile. Her expression was pure joy as she ran back to her mother. Alan stood just behind her, smiling as the small family was reunited. Her mother crying tears of joy as she wrapped her arms around her baby, tiny feet jumping while simultaneously trying to regale her mother with the adventurous evening she had had. Alan, a familiar voice called out. Turning, he saw a young woman waving her arms at him at full sprint. Alan, here, she yelled. Alice, what are you doing here? I've only been here for a couple of days now. Clearly puzzled and confused, Alan began to worry. Ruin told me that you were here, she said breathlessly. I stopped at the inn and they said you were out on the town. I've been everywhere looking for you. Finally catching her breath, standing upright, she regained her composure. I see, but how did you get here so quickly, and why did Reuben send you after me? A girl's got to keep a bit of mystery to her. I can't give away all my secrets. As for Reuben, he sent me because Sorsha has been gone missing. What do you mean she's gone missing? I don't know anything else. Reuben told me as soon as he found out. It's a total mess. Fine, first we'll need to go and gather my things. We can leave then. Alan and Alice began their trek back to the Golden Explorer. After fighting through the festival crowd, they reached the inn. The bartender was still there, going about his duties. They rushed through the crowded room to his own, and grabbing his things, Alan tossed a coin at the bartender with a nod and a thanks. Once back, he began to ready the steam air, placing his pack on it and untying its reins. What is that? Don't tell me you rode that thing here, Alice laughed. Oh yeah, you probably haven't seen one in person. Paul had it stashed away. With that, Alan slapped in the core, bringing it to life. Alice jumped back out of fright, giving a startled yelp. Alan laughed with a boyish grin. Get on, we need to move. There's no telling what's happened. He scooped her up and placed her on the animal. She nervously clung to his neck as Alan climbed on behind her. Hold on tight, he whispered into her ear. Grabbing the reins, he dug his heels into its side, sending it racing into the air. Alice screamed as it hit the ground, bounding forward. Its body moved like water, fluid and smooth. Every hoof step sent rocks shattering across the ground. Steam bellowed from its nostrils with fiery blasts. They galloped out of town with pedestrians and guards cursing their haste being left in their wake. The speeding steamer covered ground at staggering speeds. Before long, they had reached the pond. Alan had met Eric and his bounty hunter troop. Alan stopped them there to allow the steam air to cool off. He doubted that it had been pushed that hard in its entire existence. Alice was stiff from the hard push. She climbed off awkwardly, trying to loosen up. Once they had climbed off, the steam air began to walk straight down the pond's beach. Huge clouds of steam sprang forth from the water in itself. I guess we're stuck here for now, Alice exclaimed, stooped over, tossing scraps of various rocks into the water. For now, besides, sunup is just around the corner. Great, no rest for me then. Alan laughed and went about digging his grave once again. Once Alan had buried himself, Alice had to occupy herself with the steam air. After it fully cooled, it walked back to Alan's grave and began to wait. Peculiar metal horse, aren't you? She said, looking it over. Hopefully you'll last to Daedalus before you fall apart. The steam air snorted at Alice, causing her to jump. By the time the sun began to set, Alan rose from his earthly bed. After he had found his things, he gathered Alice into his arms, settling on the steam air. She fell back into his chest, passed out in a deep sleep. Her skin seemed like soft moonlight, glowing with a faint light. Ever since she was a child, her skin played tricks on others, always seeming to give off a pale light Alan could remember. the very day he found her as a baby, all wrapped in her blanket and asleep. His thoughts drifted with the sound of the steamer's hooves. A cool night's breeze blew over gray headstones, past small mausoleums with their intricate stone carvings. They depicted various scenes from old wars long forgotten by a world that was long dead. Few carvings were still legible, while others had crumpled to piles of rubble. Alan stumbled through lost while looking for a small place to hide from the coming day, settling for a mausoleum that still stood whole with the majority of the stone door in place. Alan made his camp at its base. His timing was off. It was too late to push any further, but early enough that he had time to kill. He set to organize the site while readying it for the day. Just as he was finishing up, he could hear laughter just above a whisper. "Hello? Anybody there?" He turned around slowly, followed the giggling, disembodied voices. Deep into the trees just past the last headstone was a small clearing. Moonshine poured through the canopy of the trees, bathing it with pure white light. Small flecks of light danced dazzling in a circle just above a small child. It laid on the bed of clovers and moss, while giggling at the lights. She was wrapped in a fine silk blanket that fell around her outstretched hand, grasping at the sky. Laughter came from all around her, but went silent as Alan approached the small child. The light scattered, disappearing among the trees. He picked her up with one arm, so tiny yet she brought the weight of the world with her. He paused to stare into her powdered blue eyes with golden skin like that of the sun. Whispers grew from among the trees, and he could feel the eyes burning on him. He walked back with her tight in his arms as those eyes continued to watch from the shadows. With a flicker here and there, he knew he was not alone. Climbing back through the mausoleum door, he sealed it from the inside, then waited. With the night, they climbed out of the door into the graveyard. There was something about it that had changed while they slept. The forest that had surrounded them was gone, leaving only a small patch of clover and moss. He gathered his things and the baby nestled under his jacket while they began the last leg to Daedalus. It had been almost 20 years since he last set foot here. Walking down the quiet streets, he entered the Inn of the Gilded People. He opened the door to a quiet dining room where a few candles glowed a dim orange light. Jack sat alone in a corner as he slept, sitting upright, as his dire wolves gave a low growl as they sat up, watching him across the room. Alan continued down the hall towards Sorsha's room. Slowly he opened the door, with barely enough time to dodge the flying blade that came from within. "I warn you, I'm no slouch. Just 'cause I'm pretty doesn't mean I can't take care of myself," Sorsha yelled. "Quiet, woman, it's just me. And put away your knives. Can't you see she's sleeping?" Alan held open his coat, exposing the baby. "Alan, sleeping? Is that a baby?" She gasped, dropping her knives on the floor as she rushed to get a closer look. "But where did you find this little angel?" She was by a forest, laying in a bed of clover and moss just outside the old graveyard. "I couldn't leave her there." "But Alan, there's no forest there, never was. As far as excuses, this is as good as any." Sorsa was not impressed at the least. "I know it's been quite a while since we last spoke, and it's not fair, but there's no one else to turn to. Does she have a name or anything?" "Not that I can tell. She was just lying there playing with the lights of the forest. And then a lost little girl playing in the forest. It's up to us to name her then." "Well, how about Alice? Like that one story, you know?" "I forgot how old you are sometimes, Alan. Yes, I think Alice is a good name." Sorsha finished while grabbing the baby Alice from his arms. Yet once again, Alan carried Alice through the doors, the Gilded People asleep, but all grown up. Sorsa walked into her room, closing the door behind her and taking her earrings off and setting them on her dressing room table. She sat down. A strange voice called out from behind her, "Hello, my beautiful Sorsa. You can call me Doonan." A tall, wiry man with a large smile, too big for his face, stepped out from behind the door.